Roman DeLuca was signing a $10 million donation in memory of his dead wife, when a 7-year-old boy walked onto the stage and placed her wedding ring in front of him. For 7 years, Roman had believed Clara was buried beneath a white marble angel at St. Michael's Cemetery. He had stood beside her grave in the freezing rain, watched the casket disappear into the earth, and spent the following months hunting every man he believed responsible for her death. By the time he was finished, Boston had learned why people lowered their voices whenever the DeLuca name was mentioned. None of it brought Clara back. Without her, Roman became colder, more powerful, and nearly impossible to reach. He expanded his empire across the East Coast, destroyed every rival who challenged him, and kept the world at a distance, because loving someone once had already cost him everything. That December evening, Boston's most feared Mafia boss stood beneath the golden chandeliers of St. Gabriel's children's home, surrounded by politicians, wealthy donors, and businessmen who carefully pretended not to know how his fortune had been built. Behind the stage hung a large photograph of Clara smiling beside a group of children, her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her eyes filled with the warmth Roman had spent years trying to forget. The orphanage had been her dream. Roman continued funding it, because it was the only promise to her he had not broken. He signed the check, and placed the pen beside it as the director announced the donation to the room. $10 million, given in honor of the late Clara DeLuca. Applause swept through the ballroom, but Roman barely heard it. His attention remained fixed on Clara's photograph, remembering the woman who had once told him that power meant nothing if he used it only to make people afraid. Then a small voice rose from the front of the room. "Mr. DeLuca?" The applause slowly faded. A boy stood beneath the stage, no more than 7 years old, thin beneath an oversized navy sweater with one shoelace untied. Dark curls fell across his forehead, and although his hands were red from the winter, he held one fist tightly closed as if protecting something valuable. A staff member hurried toward him. "Eli, you're supposed to be upstairs." The boy stepped away from her and kept his eyes on Roman. "I need to give him something." Roman descended from the stage, and the crowd parted before him without being asked. As he approached the child, an uncomfortable sense of recognition tightened in his chest. There was something familiar in the boy's eyes, in the stubborn set of his mouth, and in the way he refused to look away despite being frightened. When Roman stopped in front of him, Eli slowly opened his hand. A narrow gold ring rested in his palm. The ballroom seemed to disappear. Roman recognized every scratch in the band, the tiny emerald set beside the diamond, and the engraving hidden along the inside. R and C. Until the last breath. He had placed that ring on Clara's finger on their wedding day, and 7 years later, he had watched it disappear inside her casket. Roman took the ring with a hand that was no longer steady. "Where did you get this?" The boy swallowed. "My mom gave it to me." Roman's voice dropped. "What is your mother's name?" Before Eli could answer, a woman rushed into the ballroom from the service corridor wearing a faded kitchen uniform and carrying a winter coat over one arm. "Eli." The child turned toward her. "Mom, I found him." The woman stopped beneath the chandeliers, and the coat slipped from her hand. Roman looked at her face and forgot how to breathe. She was older, thinner, and marked by years he knew nothing about, but there was no mistaking the woman standing in front of him. "Clara," he whispered. Terror filled her eyes. She pulled Eli behind her, held him close, and looked at Roman as though the husband who had mourned her was now the greatest danger in the room. "Please," she said, her voice shaking. "Don't let him know you're his father." For several seconds Roman could only stare at her. The ballroom remained silent around them, but he could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. Politicians, donors, orphanage staff, and men connected to his organization were all watching the impossible unfold beneath the chandeliers. Clara DeLuca, the woman whose funeral had drawn half of Boston, was standing 10 feet away in a worn kitchen uniform, shielding a 7-year-old boy who had just called Roman his father. Roman closed his hand around the wedding ring. The metal pressed into his palm, grounding him just enough to speak. "Take the guests upstairs," he told his security chief without looking away from Clara. "Clear the ballroom." The order moved through the room immediately. Chairs scraped against the floor, conversations rose in nervous whispers, and staff members hurried to guide the children toward the upper level. Within minutes, the elegant ballroom that had been filled with applause was nearly empty. Clara remained beside the service corridor, one hand resting on Eli's shoulder, as if she expected someone to tear him away from her. Roman waited until the doors closed. Then he said, "You let me bury you." Clara's face tightened. "I had no choice. You had 7 years. I know. You watched me mourn you." Her eyes flickered with pain, but she did not look away. "I know." Roman took one slow step toward her. He had walked into rooms filled with armed enemies without hesitation, yet now every movement felt dangerous. The woman in front of him had once known every part of him, including the parts no one else was allowed to see. Now she looked at him like a stranger she had spent years preparing to fear. Eli moved closer to her side. Roman noticed the gesture immediately. The boy was protecting his mother, just as Clara was protecting him. Roman forced himself to stop several feet away. "Why does he think I am dangerous?" Clara's fingers tightened on the child's shoulder. "Because danger follows your name." That is not an answer. It is the only answer that mattered when I was trying to keep him alive. Eli looked up at Roman, studying his face with an intensity that felt painfully familiar. The boy had Clara's dark curls, but the rest of him carried pieces Roman recognized too well. The gray eyes, the stubborn mouth, the quiet way he observed everything before speaking. Roman's chest tightened again. "How old is he?" Clara hesitated. 7. The answer confirmed what the ring had already told him. She had been pregnant when she disappeared. Roman looked at her slowly. "You knew before the funeral?" "Yes. And you never told me." "I tried." Something in her tone made him pause. Clara looked toward the closed ballroom doors before lowering her voice. 3 days before the explosion, I went to your office. Your father was there." Roman's expression changed. Vittorio DeLuca had died 4 years earlier, leaving Roman control of the family and a collection of secrets no one had dared examine too closely. Clara continued, "I told him I was pregnant. I thought he would help me find a safe way to tell you, because you were already dealing with the Morelli War." Roman remembered those weeks. Bodies in the harbor, threats against his territory, and his father insisting that Clara be kept away from family business for her own protection. What did he say? Clara's eyes filled with something colder than grief. "He said a child would make you weak." Roman went still. "He told me the marriage had already distracted you enough. Then he showed me photographs of men watching the apartment, the orphanage, and every place I visited. He said if I told you about the baby, one of us would not survive the week." Roman's voice dropped. "My father threatened you?" "He did more than threaten me." She reached beneath the collar of her uniform and pulled out a thin chain. Hanging from it was a small metal tag, blackened along one edge by fire. Roman recognized it immediately. It had come from the car Clara was supposedly driving the night she died. "The explosion was staged," she said. "Your father arranged the car, the body, and the dental records. He wanted you to believe I was gone, so you would become the man he needed." Roman looked at the burned metal tag, then at the ring in his hand. 7 years of grief began rearranging itself into something far more dangerous. Clara had not abandoned him. She had been erased. Roman's jaw tightened as the truth settled into place, but before he could ask another question, Eli spoke softly from behind her. "Mom, is this the man Grandpa said would kill us if he found us?" Clara closed her eyes. Roman did not move, because the dead man he had spent years honoring had just become the architect of everything he had lost. Roman had heard children ask him difficult questions before. Some wanted to know why their parents had left them at Street Gabriel's. Others wanted to know whether money could bring someone home once they were gone. He had always found a way to answer, without revealing too much of himself. But Eli's question left him with nowhere to hide. Is this the man Grandpa said would kill us if he found us? Clara opened her eyes and immediately pulled the boy closer. Eli, you weren't supposed to hear that. I heard you talking when you thought I was asleep. Roman looked at the child standing behind her, and the anger inside him shifted into something heavier. His father had not only stolen 7 years from him, Vittorio had made Roman into a nightmare in the mind of his own son. Roman slowly lowered himself until he was at Eli's eye level, careful not to move too close. I would never hurt you, he said, and I would never hurt your mother. Eli studied him with the guarded seriousness of a child who had learned that adults did not always mean what they promised. Then why was Mom scared of you? Roman could have blamed his father. He could have said Clara had been misled or that the stories about him were exaggerated. Instead, he gave the boy the only answer that felt honest. Because I became the kind of man people had reasons to fear. Clara looked at him sharply. Roman kept his eyes on Eli. Your grandfather used that fear to make your mother believe she had nowhere safe to go. I did not know what he had done, but I should have known the man he was. Eli lowered his gaze to the floor. Mom said you visited her grave. Roman's hand tightened around the wedding ring. Every Sunday. The answer slipped out before he could stop it. For 7 years, Roman had visited the white marble angel at St. Michael's Cemetery before sunrise, when no one could watch Boston's most feared man stand alone beside a grave. He had brought white roses in winter, jasmine in summer, and on the anniversary of Clara's death, he had remained there until the groundskeeper quietly asked him to leave. Now he understood that his father had watched him mourn a woman who was still alive. Clara's face softened for only a moment before caution returned. I did not know you went there. I thought it was all I had left of you. The words settled between them with the weight of everything they had lost. Roman rose slowly and looked at her kitchen uniform, the worn shoes, and the coat that had fallen beside the service door. Where have you been? Everywhere. Your family was not looking. Providence, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, small towns where no one cared about the DeLuca name. We changed apartments whenever I saw the same car twice. I worked nights because it was easier to stay unnoticed, and Eli learned not to tell people where he was born. Roman looked at the boy again. Why come back to Boston? Clara hesitated, then glanced toward Eli. The child's expression changed. He suddenly seemed interested in the floor. Roman noticed. What is it? Clara's voice became quieter. Eli was born with a heart condition. It was manageable when he was younger, but 6 months ago the doctors said he would eventually need surgery. The specialist willing to take his case works with Street Gabriels. Roman felt the room tilt again. His son had been sick, and he had known nothing. I can bring in the best surgeons in the country. That is not why I told you. I can have a medical team here tonight. And that, Clara said, is exactly why I was afraid you would find us. Roman frowned. You still think power solves everything, she continued. You hear that your son needs help, and your first instinct is to take control of the hospital, the doctors, and everyone standing between you and the outcome. But the men who served your father understand that instinct. They know where you move money, which doctors you trust, and which guards you call first. My father has been dead for 4 years. The people who obeyed him are not. Before Roman could respond, the ballroom doors opened, and Dominic, his security chief, entered with a phone in his hand. The calm expression he normally wore was gone. Boss, we have a problem. Roman turned. What happened? Someone accessed the orphanage's private employee records 10 minutes ago. They searched for Clara's alias, Eli's medical file, and tonight's guest list. Clara went pale. Dominic looked at the wedding ring in Roman's hand, then at the child standing beside her. Whoever opened those records already knows she is alive. Roman's voice dropped. Can you identify them? Not yet. But they used an authorization code that belonged to your father. Clara grabbed Eli's coat from the floor. We have to leave. Roman stepped toward her. You are not running again. She looked at him with raw fear in her eyes. You still don't understand. If Vittorio's people know Eli is your son, they will not wait until morning. Roman did not argue with Clara in front of Eli. He had spent years issuing commands that ended conversations, but this time he understood that forcing her to stay would only prove every fear she carried about him. So he turned to Dominic instead. Seal the main entrance, shut down the elevators, and move every child upstairs to the east wing, quietly. Dominic nodded and left without asking questions. Clara pulled Eli's coat around his shoulders, her hands moving quickly even though they were shaking. There is a service tunnel beneath the kitchen. It leads to the old church parking lot. Roman looked at her. How do you know that? I have worked here for 8 months. I learned every exit the first week. The answer carried more pain than she intended. Clara had not chosen this orphanage because it was safe. She had chosen it because survival had taught her never to enter a building without knowing how to leave. Roman glanced toward Eli, who stood silently between them with the teddy bear tucked beneath one arm. The boy's face had gone pale, but he was trying not to show fear. Roman lowered his voice. Does he understand what is happening? He understands too much. Clara reached for Eli's hand, but before they could move, the ballroom lights went out. The chandeliers died at once, leaving only the red emergency lamps glowing along the walls. Eli gripped his mother's sleeve. Roman drew the handgun beneath his jacket, keeping it pointed toward the floor so the child would not see more than necessary. Stay behind me. Clara gave him a sharp look. You do not get to turn this into a war. They already did. A soft metallic sound came from the corridor outside. Someone had opened the service door. Roman moved in front of Clara and Eli while Dominic's men spread through the ballroom. No one spoke. In the dim red light, the room that had held donors and applause only minutes earlier now felt like a trap built long before any of them arrived. Then Eli whispered, "Mom, my chest hurts." Clara dropped beside him immediately. Roman felt the air leave his lungs. Eli pressed one hand against his ribs and tried to breathe through the panic, but each breath came faster than the last. It is the stress, Clara said, forcing calm into her voice. He needs his medication. Where is it? In my locker beneath the kitchen. Roman looked toward the service corridor. Exactly where the sound had come from. Clara stood. I'm going. No. He needs it. I will get it. You do not know which locker. Then show me. For a second, they stared at each other, both unwilling to yield. Roman saw the fear in her face, but beneath it was the same stubborn courage he remembered from the woman who once stood between him and an injured stranger during a street shooting because she refused to let anyone die alone. He had loved that courage. His father had feared it. Stay close, Roman said. They moved through the service corridor with Dominic and 2 guards ahead of them. The hallway smelled of soap, steam, and old brick. Every sound felt too loud. Eli's uneven breathing, Clara's shoes against the tile, the distant creak of a door closing somewhere below. At the kitchen entrance, Roman stopped. A man in a black overcoat stood beside the employee lockers. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, and calm enough to be dangerous. Roman recognized him immediately. Father Matteo Caruso had performed Vittorio DeLuca's funeral. He had also blessed Clara's empty casket. The priest looked at Roman, then at Clara and Eli. I hoped you would never bring them back here, he said. Roman raised his weapon. Step away from the lockers. Father Matteo did not move. Instead, he removed an envelope from inside his coat and placed it on the counter. Your father left this with me 7 years ago. He said I was to deliver it only if Clara returned to Boston with the boy. Clara went still. Roman's eyes narrowed. You knew she was alive? I knew someone escaped the car before it exploded. I did not know who until tonight. Eli leaned against Clara, breathing harder now. His medicine, Clara said. Please. The priest opened one of the lockers and handed her a small blue pouch. Clara dropped to her knees, found the medication, and helped Eli take it while Roman kept his eyes fixed on Father Matteo. What is in the envelope? The priest looked toward the child before answering. The reason Vittorio wanted everyone to believe Clara was dead. Roman picked up the envelope and tore it open. Inside was a photograph of Eli as a newborn. On the back, in his father's handwriting, were 7 words. "The boy is not the only DeLuca heir." Roman read the sentence twice, but the meaning refused to settle. The boy is not the only DeLuca heir. He turned the photograph over again, searching for another message, another name, anything that could explain why his father had kept a picture of Eli as a newborn and written those words across the back. "There was only one child," Clara said quietly. Father Matteo looked at her with an expression that made Roman's stomach tighten. "That is what you were told." Clara stood slowly, one hand still resting on Eli's shoulder. The medication had begun to steady his breathing, but her own breaths were becoming shorter. "No," she said. "I gave birth to one son. You delivered twins." The kitchen seemed to fall silent around them. Clara shook her head immediately. "That is not true." Father Matteo reached inside the envelope and removed a folded hospital document, yellowed at the edges. He placed it beside the photograph. Roman recognized Clara's false name near the top of the page. Beneath it were 2 lines recording live births. 1 male, 1 female. Clara stared at the paper without touching it. "I heard another baby cry," she whispered. The memory seemed to rise inside her, before she could stop it. She gripped the edge of the counter, her face draining of color. "The nurse told me I was confused because of the medication. She said another woman had delivered in the room beside mine." Father Matteo lowered his gaze. "The nurse worked for Vittorio." Roman felt rage moving through him, but this time it did not arrive as an explosion. It came slowly, coldly, filling every space his grief had occupied for 7 years. "What happened to the girl?" "I was never told her location," the priest said. "Only that Vittorio had arranged for her to be raised under another name." Clara looked at Roman, and for the first time since appearing in the ballroom, the fear in her eyes was not directed at him. It was the fear of a mother, realizing one of her children had been stolen while she was too weak to fight. "I left the hospital with Eli the next morning," she said. "They told me there had been complications. They told me I was lucky he survived." Roman looked down at the medical form again. A second line had been partially blacked out, but a notation remained visible beside the female infant's record, transferred by private authorization. The signature beneath it belonged to Vittorio DeLuca. Eli moved closer to Clara. "I have a sister." Clara closed her eyes briefly before kneeling beside him. "I don't know, sweetheart, but the paper says I do." Her face tightened with pain. "Yes, it does." Roman watched her, trying to remain calm for their son while the truth tore through her. 7 years ago, she had believed she was escaping with her only child. Now she was learning that every mile she put between herself and Boston had also carried her father away from a daughter she never knew was alive. Roman turned to Father Matteo. "Why keep this from me?" "Because your father believed the girl could be useful." Roman's expression hardened. "Useful how?" "As leverage against you if Clara ever returned. As a successor, he could shape without your influence." Vittorio feared that Eli, raised by Clara, would inherit her conscience. He wanted one DeLuca child raised to love, and another raised to obey. The cruelty of it settled over the room. Roman had spent his entire life believing Vittorio valued blood above everything. In truth, his father valued control, and even his grandchildren had been reduced to pieces on a board. "Where is she?" Clara asked. Father Matteo hesitated. Roman stepped closer. "You said you did not know her location." "I did not," the priest replied. "Not until 3 weeks ago." He removed a second photograph from his coat. This one showed a young girl standing outside a private academy in upstate New York. She appeared to be about 7, with dark hair braided over one shoulder, and Clara's eyes looking directly into the camera. Around her neck hung the other half of the DeLuca onyx crest. Clara covered her mouth. Roman took the photograph carefully, afraid that gripping it too tightly might somehow harm the child inside it. "Her name is Lucia Valle," Father Matteo said. She lives under the protection of a man who served your father for 30 years. Who? Before the priest could answer, the kitchen door opened behind them. Dominic entered with blood on his collar and urgency in his face. Boss, the men outside were a distraction. Someone accessed the orphanage through the east wing, but they were not looking for Clara or Eli. Roman's eyes narrowed. Then what did they want? Dominic looked at the photograph in Roman's hand. The envelope, he said. They wanted the location of the girl. Roman folded the photograph once and slipped it inside his jacket. Who accessed the east wing? Dominic wiped the blood from his collar with the back of his hand. 2 men. One is dead, and the other escaped through the chapel courtyard. Neither carried identification, but one of them had a Vale Academy access card. Father Matteo's face changed. Roman noticed immediately. You recognize the name. The priest looked toward Clara and Eli before answering. Vale Academy is not a school in the ordinary sense. Vittorio helped finance it years ago. Publicly, it is a private institution for the children of diplomats and wealthy families. In reality, it was built to train the sons and daughters of men who served the DeLuca organization. Clara stared at the photograph of the girl now hidden inside Roman's jacket. Train them for what? Father Matteo did not soften the truth. Obedience, strategy, loyalty, the ability to survive in your world without ever questioning it. Roman felt Clara's fear sharpen beside him. Their daughter had not simply been taken and raised under another name. She had been shaped by the same system that had turned Roman into the man standing in that kitchen. Who has her? He asked. The priest hesitated once more, then said, Gabriel Vale. Roman's expression hardened. Gabriel had been one of Vittorio's oldest advisors, a quiet man who rarely appeared in photographs and never stayed in one city for long. He had vanished shortly after Vittorio's death, taking money, records, and several loyal soldiers with him. Roman had assumed Gabriel fled because he feared the new leadership. Now he understood that the man had been protecting something more valuable than money. He raised my daughter, Roman said. Father Matteo nodded. As his own. Clara stepped toward him. Does she know who she is? I do not know. Does she know she has a mother? I do not know. Does she know Eli exists? The priest's silence answered before his words did. I doubt it. Clara turned away and pressed one hand against the counter, struggling to remain steady. Eli stood beside her, watching every expression, even though no one wanted him to understand the full weight of the conversation. Roman approached slowly. Clara. She turned on him with tears in her eyes. We have to go now. We will. No commission meeting. No negotiations. No waiting for your men to make calls. She has already waited 7 years. Roman accepted the accusation even though it was not directed only at him. Clara had spent years learning that every delay in the DeLuca world came with a cost, and she was no longer willing to let powerful men decide how long a mother should wait for her child. You are right, he said. The agreement surprised her. Roman looked at Dominic. Prepare 2 vehicles, one visible, one unmarked. Send the visible convoy toward Logan Airport and leak that Clara and Eli are leaving Boston. Dominic understood immediately. You want Gabriel's people to follow the wrong car. I want them far away from New York before they realize we never went south. Clara frowned. And where are we going? North. To the academy? Not directly. Gabriel will expect that. Roman took out his phone and opened an encrypted map. Vale Academy sat in the Adirondacks, surrounded by forest and private roads, with only one official entrance. There is an old hydroelectric tunnel beneath the western ridge, he said. My father used it to move supplies without inspection. Gabriel may have changed the surface security, but he never knew I found the original plans. Clara looked at him carefully. You have been there before. Once. I was 15. The answer carried more history than Roman intended. Vittorio had taken him to Vale Academy after Roman hesitated during his first violent order. He had spent 3 weeks there being taught that fear was weakness, mercy was dangerous, and family loyalty mattered more than conscience. Roman had never spoken about those weeks, not even to Clara. She saw enough in his face to understand. "This is where your father made you into him," she said. Roman looked down at Eli, then toward the photograph hidden against his chest. He tried. A distant alarm sounded through the orphanage. Dominic checked his phone. "The police have been called. Someone reported an armed attack and named your organization." Roman's jaw tightened. The longer they remained, the more difficult it would become to leave without exposing Clara and Eli to cameras, questions, and enemies. He looked at Father Matteo. "You are coming with us?" The priest shook his head. "I cannot. You knew about the records." "I knew enough to be ashamed." Roman stepped closer. "Then be useful." Before Father Matteo could respond, Clara's phone vibrated inside her coat pocket. She pulled it out and stared at the screen. There was no number, only a photograph. Lucia stood in a dark room, still wearing the Vale Academy uniform. She was unharmed, but fear showed in her eyes. Beneath the image was a single message: "Bring Roman DeLuca to the academy before dawn, or the girl will learn why her mother abandoned her." Clara read the message twice before handing the phone to Roman. Her face had gone completely still, but Roman knew that kind of stillness. It was not calm. It was what happened when fear became too large to show. "They want you," she said. Roman looked at the photograph again. Lucia stood beneath a single overhead light, her academy jacket buttoned to the throat. She was trying to look brave, but one hand was curled tightly against her side, a child pretending not to be afraid. He recognized the habit, because Eli did the same thing. "They already have what they need," Roman said. "The photograph proves Gabriel knows we found the records." Clara's voice sharpened. "Then we go. We go carefully." "No." She stepped closer, keeping her voice low so Eli would not hear. "You do not get to slow this down because your world taught you to turn every rescue into a negotiation." Roman held her gaze. "And you do not get to walk into a trap because guilt is making you reckless." The words struck harder than he intended. Clara looked away, but not before he saw the pain in her eyes. "She has spent 7 years believing no one came for her," she said. "I am not losing another hour." Roman softened his voice. "Neither am I." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eli moved between them. "Are we going to get my sister?" Clara looked down at him. "Yes." Roman crouched, so they were eye level. "But you are not coming inside the academy." Eli's expression tightened. "She is my sister, and that is why I need you safe." "You did not keep Mom safe." The words landed with quiet precision. Roman accepted them. "No," he said. "I did not." Eli watched him, waiting for an excuse that never came. Roman continued, "But I can make a better choice now." The boy looked toward Clara, then back at Roman. "Will you bring her back?" Roman had made promises to men before. Promises about money, territory, revenge, and survival. None had ever felt as serious as this one. "Yes." He rose and turned to Dominic. "Get the vehicles ready. We leave in 5 minutes." They moved through the orphanage's rear corridor, while police sirens grew louder outside. Dominic sent the decoy convoy toward the airport, and Roman took Clara, Eli, and Father Matteo through the old service exit beneath the chapel. The unmarked SUV waited in the alley with its headlights off. For the first hour, no one spoke. Boston disappeared behind them, replaced by dark highways, frozen fields, and black trees bending beneath the December wind. Eli slept with his head against Clara's shoulder, still holding the teddy bear. Roman sat across from them. Every few minutes, Clara looked down at her phone, waiting for another message. None came. At 3 a.m, Dominic left the highway and turned onto a narrow road bordered by snow-covered pines. The academy was still miles away, but Roman could already feel the place in his body. He remembered the locked rooms, The cold showers, the instructors who taught boys to stop asking whether an order was right and start asking only whether it would be obeyed. Clara noticed the change in his face. "What happened to you there?" she asked quietly. Roman looked out the window. "My father brought me after I refused to hurt someone who had betrayed him." "How old were you?" 15. Clara's expression shifted. For the first time that night, she looked at him not as the man who had failed her, but as the boy Vittorio had once broken. Roman continued, before sympathy could settle between them. "They taught me that love made men predictable, that mercy created enemies, that anyone who could be used against you had to be removed before they became a weakness." Clara glanced down at Eli. "And now Lucia has been raised by the same people." "Yes." The road narrowed until the vehicle could go no farther. Dominic stopped beside an abandoned ranger station half buried in snow. Roman checked his weapon, then unfolded the old tunnel plans across the hood. "The hydroelectric entrance is half a mile west," he said. "Dominic and I go inside. Clara, you stay here with Eli and Father Matteo." Clara shook her head. "I'm coming. Gabriel asked for me. He has my daughter, and he may use you to control her." Clara stepped closer. "She needs to see that I came." Roman understood then that no argument would change her mind. Before he could answer, Clara's phone vibrated again. This time, the message contained no photograph, only an audio file. She pressed play. A young girl's voice filled the freezing air. "Mr. DeLuca, Gabriel says you have 10 minutes. He also says my mother is a liar, and if she really wanted me, she would have found me years ago." Clara covered her mouth. Then, another voice entered the recording. Older, calm, familiar. "Gabriel Valle, come through the western tunnel, Roman. Bring Clara. Leave your men behind." Roman looked toward the dark forest. Gabriel had not merely found the old entrance. He had been waiting for them to use it. Roman left Dominic with Eli and Father Matteo, then entered the western tunnel beside Clara. The passage was narrow, damp, and lined with old electrical cables that hummed beneath the stone. Roman remembered walking the same corridor at 15, while instructors explained that fear could be trained out of a boy if enough doors were locked behind him. This time, Clara walked beside him. At the end of the tunnel, a steel door opened into a dim observation room overlooking the Academy's training hall. Lucia stood behind reinforced glass in her uniform, watched by Gabriel Vale and 2 guards. The moment Clara saw her daughter, she stopped breathing. Lucia had Roman's grey eyes, but the expression inside them belonged to Clara. Cautious, intelligent, and trying desperately not to cry. Gabriel pressed a button, activating the speaker between the rooms. "You came," he said. Clara stepped toward the glass. "Lucia, my name is Clara. I am your mother." The girl's face hardened exactly as she had been taught. "My mother abandoned me." "No." Clara placed her palm against the glass. "You were taken before I knew you existed. I heard you cry, but they told me I imagined it. I have spent every minute since learning the truth trying to reach you." Lucia looked toward Gabriel for guidance. That single glance told Roman everything. Gabriel had raised her to seek permission before trusting her own heart. Roman faced him. "You wanted me here. Let her go." Gabriel smiled faintly. Vittorio believed one heir should inherit compassion and the other discipline. Eli became Clara's child. Lucia became ours. She is not an experiment. She is the future of your family. Roman removed his weapon and placed it on the floor. Gabriel's smile disappeared. Roman had finally understood the trap. Gabriel expected violence because violence would prove every lesson Lucia had been taught about the DeLuca name. "I am not here to claim an heir," Roman said. "I am here to bring a child home." Clara turned toward him, surprised. Lucia was watching too. Roman stepped away from the weapon and looked directly at the girl. "You do not have to trust us tonight. You do not have to call us family. But you deserve the freedom to decide who you become. For the first time, Lucia's composure cracked. Gabriel reached for her shoulder. She pulled away. Then the academy alarms began to sound. Dominic's voice came through Roman's earpiece. "We have control of the building." The guards lowered their weapons when the doors opened behind them. Clara rushed into the training hall, but she stopped several feet from Lucia, rather than forcing an embrace. She simply opened her arms. After 7 years of being taught never to need anyone, Lucia took one uncertain step toward her mother, then another, and when she finally broke into a run, Clara caught the daughter she had never been allowed to hold. Gabriel Vale was taken into custody before sunrise, but Roman did not allow the academy to disappear quietly. He ordered every record copied, every child identified, and every family notified. The place Vittorio had built to manufacture obedience would never train another child again. Lucia left the academy holding Clara's hand, though she still looked back at the building, as if someone might order her to return. She did not speak during the drive to Boston. She sat beside Eli, studying the brother she had never known, while he showed her the worn teddy bear he had carried through every move. "He only has one eye," Lucia said. "So do some pirates," Eli replied. "That makes him important." For the first time, Lucia smiled. Roman watched them from the front seat and felt 7 lost years settle heavily inside him. He could not recover their first steps, their birthdays, or the nights Clara had faced alone. He could only decide what kind of father he would become now. Lucia did not call him Dad. She called him Mr. DeLuca. Roman never corrected her. When Eli underwent heart surgery 3 weeks later, Roman remained outside the operating room beside Clara for nearly 6 hours. He did not call the surgeon every 10 minutes or threaten anyone into promising a result. He simply sat there, held Clara's hand when she allowed it, and waited with the same helpless fear she had carried alone for years. The surgery was successful. Months passed, and the family began healing in small, imperfect ways. Lucia started therapy and attended school with Eli. Clara moved into a quiet house outside Boston, but she refused to return to Roman's mansion. "You do not get us back because you rescued us once," she told him. "You get the chance to prove you will stay." Roman accepted those terms. Every morning, he drove to the house before work. He helped Eli with breakfast, listened while Lucia described lessons she pretended not to enjoy, and left only after Clara reminded him that an empire was still waiting. One evening, Lucia found Roman standing beside Clara's empty grave at St. Michael's Cemetery. "Why do you still come here?" she asked. Roman looked at the white marble angel. "Because this is where I buried the man I used to be." Lucia considered his answer, then quietly placed her hand in his. Roman did not move. He simply held on. Roman had spent most of his life believing that family was protected through power, fear, and absolute control. Clara had survived long enough to teach him that real protection looked different. It meant staying when no one was watching, listening when forgiveness was not guaranteed, and loving children without deciding who they were supposed to become. He could not return the 7 years stolen from Eli and Lucia, nor could he erase the loneliness Clara had endured while he mourned an empty grave. What he could do was show up every day and earn the place he had once assumed belonged to him. Months later, Clara placed her wedding ring back on her finger, not as a promise that the past was forgotten, but as proof that their future would be chosen freely. Roman DeLuca still controlled one of the most powerful organizations in Boston, yet the greatest victory of his life was not an empire reclaimed through violence. It was a family that chose to let him come home. Do you believe Roman deserved Clara's forgiveness, or were 7 lost years too much to overcome? Share your opinion in the comments, and subscribe for more emotional mafia romance stories about betrayal, sacrifice, family, and redemption.